Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Dean Miller.
No, it's okay. It's okay. You don't have to applaud. You're all eating. But I do have to come clean and apologize. I have no idea why I put this on. It is clearly New York Knicks colors. And I just want to make sure that you all know, as a rabid, loyal Sixers fan, I want to apologize to the city of Philadelphia, the Philadelphia 76ers, and my fellow fans. I will take this off as soon as I possibly can. All right. Welcome back. You got a real great taste of this morning talking about emerging technology specific to investments and talent. And it's time to move into the afternoon, where we're going to explore AI best practices, use cases, and ethical considerations. These are really critical things to dive deeper on. And we have got to kick this off with a panel surrounding AI responsibility. After a short break, yes, a short break right after that panel, we'll be back in here for a not-to-miss keynote conversation with Claude. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Odia Kagan, partner at Fox Rothschild, to kick off our first afternoon session.
All right, I'm going to introduce, the panel is going to introduce themselves, so we're all going to take a seat. And
You've got a mic in your seat.
yeah, we have mics in our seats, so where do you guys want to go, there? Cool. Okay. Wow. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm Odia Kagan, and I'm going to moderate the panel. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the panel, and I'm going to, the best introductions are done first person. So David, maybe you can start, and then Swagata and Elzar.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Great to be here today. My name is David Don. I am Senior Vice President for Public Policy at Comcast Corporation. Looking forward to a great discussion today about AI and the regulatory framework around it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Swagata Ashwani. I'm a principal data scientist with Boomi. I am intrigued by the responsible and explainable AI aspect, and looking forward to having an engaging conversation with you all.
Hello, everybody. My name is Elzar Camper. I'm a managing director at CBIZ Pivot Point Security. I oversee all consulting practices around cybersecurity, AI governance and advisory services, and looking forward to today's conversation.
So thank you. So we know that every conference now, and kind of I think every dinner table conversation, and everybody, like, instead of saying grace, everybody needs to say AI, and those that are, you know, extra cool can say responsible AI. So if you want to say like responsible AI 3 times, you're sort of, you know, will have done your, you know, your reps for today. What I want to do is I want to, rather than just give a very high level kind of overview of what's going on, I want to give a use case, and then each of us are going to give a different perspective. So I come at it from, I work a lot with clients on AI where there's personal information involved. I'm a data privacy attorney, and so this is either you are the developer of the AI, or you are the purchaser and deployer, as the European legislation calls it, of the AI. So we're going to take a use case, and then each of us is going to kind of walk you through our little perspective of the use case, hopefully giving you some takeaways of how to approach these problems in real life. So this is to the panel and to everybody. So you're contacted by a client's by a customer's chief compliance and ethics officer, and they tell you that they're getting a lot of pressure from the workforce to allow them to use ChatGPT at work, and also you're getting a lot of pressure from HR to onboard an AI-based tool that helps assess candidates for employment or for promotion. And so Elzar, you get approached by this potential customer, and how do you approach this? Like, what are the steps or the path that you recommend? What do you tell them?
So from a governance perspective, the first thing I'm going to think about is what controls do you have in place today? What controls can you get in place in the next 30 days? And then what should your overall governance framework look like, or I should say environment look like, in the next 6 months? So when you first think of things like, our staff wants to use an LLM, and they're putting pressure on the organization, that pretty much means that people are already using those LLMs, and someone has brought it up, hey, should we be doing this, and what should the organization be saying about it? So I think it starts out with simple things. Does your organization have an AI acceptable use policy? Have you communicated how the organization is requesting that their employees use AI or not use AI? So I think it starts off by simple suggestions of moving the program forward, the idea of incremental changes. As you start to look at the individual use cases, so the first one was, ChatGTP, that LLM. You have to look at it from the perspective of what is the impact, and I think that's when you use something like a system impact assessment. You start to look at the risks that are being presented by that LLM. Is it affecting individuals, groups of individuals? What are the use cases? How do the employees want to use those things? And start to identify any potential biases that could potentially be introduced. So incremental changes, either get your internal employees trained to be able to operate this and execute this assessment, or work with an outside firm that specializes in something like this. When I then think about the idea of an HR system, the first thing comes to mind is Amazon in 2018. This is when they decided to suspend the use of an AI operations around their promotion system because it showed gender bias. So you need to start thinking of what could be introduced by using an HR system in your environment that could potentially be responsible for making these decisions and the automation of those decisions, and then how those being assessed. So the same concept, making sure there's acceptable use policy in place, and then making sure there's another impact assessment done specific to the biases and risk that HR system could potentially introduce to your organization. So from that perspective, that's how I would immediately address what do we need to do today, and what should we do in the next 30 to 45 days to meet these business needs.
And for the governance part of it, so if this is, let's say if it's a smaller company, right, then the sort of distance between governance and getting the right result is a smaller distance, right? I used to work, we did a deal once and with open source issues, and I asked the company, how do you guys prevent, open source from being onboarded to the code? And they're like, I say, Joe, don't do it. So if you've got one person who's doing it, the governance is easy. If you have a bigger company, right, that comes with complexity. So the first one question is, if you have some sort of enterprise risk framework, can you or should you fold your AI governance into that? Are there unique aspects that you need to address? Are there like unique, position holders that need to be involved?
So we recommend a comprehensive approach to AI risk, and it kind of has pretty much 3 different pieces. The first one being looking at something like either ISO 42001, which is an AI management system that allows you to bring in the controls to mitigate the risk specifically to AI. We also recommend that you consider an information security management system like ISO 27001 or some other kind of cybersecurity framework controls. There's many things that you can use from, whether it's NIST, whether it's the CIS, critical security controls, something that addresses the cybersecurity concerns. And then we also recommend, thirdly, that you look at privacy, whether that's using a framework like ISO 27701 or just making sure that you're compliant with CCPA, some kind of framework, some kind of standard, some kind of checklist to align your program with. If you're looking at the idea that you're developing software or developing AI-enabled systems, we recommend frameworks like NIST 800-218, which talks about the secure software development framework. You can also use things like OWASP. They have really good software assurance maturity models that you can follow when it comes to your development. And then today, actually on the way over here, I saw that NIST released a brand new generative AI portfolio about 3 hours ago. I believe it was NIST 60I. And so it gives some really good feedback around the risk you should be aware of when you're implementing generative AI into your organization. And all of those things are really tied to the NIST AI risk management framework. So all of these frameworks overlap. We do recommend a comprehensive approach. And that's what we think is the best way to mitigate the risk of AI.
And just to maybe either, I don't know, we sort of need to kind of move the dial between scare you more or scare you less. So when comprehensive and also the NIST framework itself means that, and also the legal standards that I'll touch on a little bit later say that you need to, just like with information security, you need to provide the protections, right? And governance is basically a means to an end. The end is the result. You need to do it in a way that is related to and aligned with the size of the company, the complexity of the data, the sensitivity of the data, et cetera, right? So if you're like a 50-people company, deploying the NIST AI risk management framework is going to look very different for you than it is for like when Comcast is trying to do that for themselves, right? So that you know, bear in mind that that's the case. And actually what Elzar was saying is a really good kind of segue to Swagata, who deals with this on the developer side. So like you are approached by a client to develop this type of stuff, right? Specifically an AI that addresses HR considerations. What are things that you have incorporated into your systems, and also what feedback are you now getting from customers on what they're looking for you to provide in order for them to retain your services for this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So coming from an implementation and developer point of view, when I have a conversation with the chief ethics officer on what AI tool to pick, the most important question that I would like to address is two things. First is whether that system is transparent or not, and whether that system can mitigate bias or risk. So those are the two main constraints that will allow me to pick the right AI tool. When it comes to transparency and trust in any AI system, the key aspect is explainability. So when I talk to an LLM today, that LLM gives me an answer or a response. I don't know whether I can trust it or is it transparent or not. For me or any end user, and we are building something which is using HR data. So we have a lot of employee data like their job, their PII, their demographic information. All of this information is extremely critical to analyze. So when we are looking at HR data, we need to, and we're building a model based on that data. It's important when you give a recommendation. In our case, let's say we are recommending whether John versus Lisa, who needs to be promoted. And like Elzar had mentioned, the Amazon scenario where there was a bias issue. There is also an issue with transparency. Like, let's say my model is predicting that John needs to be promoted. Now, I don't know why, like the HR or any personnel who's using the AI and talking to the AI model needs to know why John was recommended, whether it was because he had great performance review or whether his tenure was long. Like, what are the features that went into building that model led to that prediction? And sometimes these are very simple use cases. The response or the reasoning could be very complicated. It could not be just one particular feature. It could be a combination of 4 or 5, which makes it compelling to predict. So I think there is a need for explainability, and that is coming up with a lot of tools and technology. There is Google's What If tool. There is also IBM's 360 Fairness tool. These tools enable the explainability. In fact, this morning, if those of you who saw Martian's demo, I had a conversation, and they are also implementing this explainability aspect, wherein whatever response is generated by the LLM, they describe it, hey, this response is good because of so-and-so reason. That's why you should trust this response. So the trust and transparency aspect is key in determining which AI tool to choose. And moving on to the second and important aspect, and what the Amazon use case was, bias. And we all know that when you have HR data, there is no data set that exists which is completely bias-free in terms of gender or race or age or whatnot. So when you're predicting or building, or a model is learning from that data, it can definitely have bias. And in order to understand why and what we can do to mitigate that bias and risk, we need to, again, use some tools and do regular data audits. So again, there are tools like Google's Vertex, which kind of tell you like, hey, maybe your data is oversampled for this particular age or this particular feature. Maybe you need to do something, some sort of oversampling. And it's interesting to see that bias does not always happen with data. It can also happen with the model that you've built. So you need to assess, like, maybe the model that I have used does not weigh in. We need to do some resampling of the weights. So it could happen because of data, it could happen because of model. So again, it's important to, whatever AI tool you're using, it's important that that AI tool can automatically learn to mitigate that bias and tell us like, hey, maybe your data is not sampled, maybe your data is oversampled in gender or age or whatever feature. Maybe you need to add more data. So it's important to mitigate that bias and risk. So those are the two main key factors that I would advise to my chief ethics officer.
So you're hearing from Swagata that basically, and this is the real, as a lawyer I know that the main reason isn't, the main reason for doing something usually isn't, but the regulator is going to come after you. It's, but your clients or your customers are not going to want this product because there are issues with it. And basically what Swagata is saying is like, this is already a requirement by customers that are acquiring the AI. Now the reason behind it is that the regulators and the lawsuits are coming after the customers that are deploying, and technically also the developers can be in scope. So I'm going to recap a little bit and give some color around what Swagata was saying from, I'm going to be like the ghost of AI present, and then David is going to be the ghost of AI future, right? So there's a business reason to do it. There's also a legal reason to do it, right? So we chose an HR use case on purpose because HR involves information of people that identifies people. There are obviously other types of AI that can be risky and don't involve personal information. The ubiquitous example that I always think of, even though there are probably more, like nuclear power plants or like electrical power grid, right? There's a lot of stuff that could go wrong with AI there that would be really impactful on our lives, but has nothing to do with personal information. The personal information piece is risky and significant because whenever there is personal information touched by the AI, I heard the head of the California Privacy Protection Authority call it, we get involved when there is PI in the AI. So when there is PI in the AI, all of the privacy laws, of which we now have, I don't know, around 20, like 17 and counting, like the TLC show, right? All of the state laws, the FTC, now after the executive order trickling down from government requirements to government contracts, there are requirements for transparency. There are prohibitions on bias. There is a New York City law on AI bias in HR already, where the employers would be liable for the bias. The EEOC, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, has already done a settlement on discrimination carried out by AI. So the takeaway here is, right, especially with respect to HR, if you discriminate and the AI did it, that is not a good excuse, right? And so transparency and disclosing that this is done by AI and how is it done is necessary, because without it, when Elzar's customers come to him and he's like, hey, let's do a risk assessment, we're like, we don't know what this does, that's not going to be helpful. So it has to be not a black box, otherwise you can't do your risk assessment. People need to know about it, and it can't discriminate. So all of these requirements, the risk assessment, understanding what's going on, conveying this understanding to the people so they can understand, all of that is already in existing laws, some of which are enforced by regulators, some of which have a private right of action. And so there is already like a lot to do today, but there might be a lot more to do in the very near future, right? So David, you closely follow the tea leaves of the AI. So what are you seeing happening, and what should companies either developing or deploying need to look out for?
Thanks, Odia. So as a recovering lawyer, former lawyer, I sit on this panel and think, man, did I make the right decision to move to public policy? because these are hard legal questions, and there aren't clear answers, so it makes it really hard for those in the legal field. Fortunately, in my career as a public policy at Comcast, I get to deal with the world of the ought as opposed to the world of the is. And in that world, there's a lot going on right now in the AI space. So what does that mean? We've got to look at it. One easy way to understand it, perhaps, is jurisdictionally. We have a lot of jurisdictions who are interested in this. I think you just mentioned California. We hear about NIST. I'm trying to remember which other ones I might have heard, maybe the executive order. So that's at the White House. And then, of course, we have European regulations. And so each of these jurisdictions are taking a different track. Well, maybe not totally different, but it's a little bit like what happened with privacy. And what we have is the federal government, for a lot of reasons, unable to set clear federal standards. And what that does is it creates a little bit of a vacuum. So in that vacuum, we have different jurisdictions trying to regulate or issue laws that govern how AI is to be deployed. So first you have what we have most recently, maybe not first, but the most recent major advancement here, or step here, is the EU AI Act. So the European Union has adopted a law which is likely going to significantly influence what the US eventually does, not unlike GDPR and other ways in which Europe takes the lead. We have a lot of reasons why the US is not taking the lead at the federal level. Some of it has to do with the politics we're all aware of, and some of it has to do with just how our government functions in general. So we have these vacuums. So EU takes the lead in one aspect, and then you have various states, like you mentioned, California taking the lead. And the risk here, of course, is that there are value judgments in all of these decisions. And the European values are not always the same as ours, especially with things like privacy. And then, of course, the values in California are very different than some of the values in a state like Texas. And so you're going to have the absence of federal legislation creates these vacuums where different values start filling in the vacuum, some of which we may or may not agree to as a nation. So what are some of the core principles we look at when trying to influence legislation? I think there's maybe two or three. Number one is that the regulation should match the risk. And not all AI has the equal amount of risk. Sometimes you're touching PI, in which case there's more risk there, or you have to deal with questions like bias. So that's high risk. But then there are other applications, like where we'll deploy AI in our network to observe if there's any kind of anomalies, to anticipate an outage, with the customer not even knowing, or it's not an outage, but some kind of anomaly in service. Could be an outage. So we deploy AI for a function like that. That poses really no risk on sort of that regulatory legal front, or little to no risk. And so we would, we would contend that you've got to have laws and regulations that match the level of risk, and you don't just have AI regulation. That's number one. I think another core principle, and we sort of touched on this a little, is developer versus deployer. Right? If you are developing AI, you have got to be very sensitive to things like PI or open source or bias, and that's very different than someone who acquires that, acquires a product and deploys it in their network or in their processes and is a deployer. And the EU Act actually recognizes a distinction between deployer and developer, and also a little bit of a risk assessment too. Whether I agree with all their lines is less important, but it is a little bit of a model here for the US. So that's the second one. And then the third one is, at least in the US, we can't do this state by state. That is, this technology does not observe state boundaries. And a little bit like privacy, we need a federal framework here. And I think eventually we'll get there as we start developing some consensus as to what our priorities are here in the US. And if we don't, like it's happened in other spaces, the European model and the California model will eventually dominate how we talk about these issues, and that has its pros and cons.
Thank you. So we have a few more minutes that we're going to sort of get some more perspectives from the panel, and then we have some time, a few minutes for questions. So I wanted to kind of give you a preview for, we're happy to take questions, so get them ready. I think what David was saying is that it is ideal that we would have regulation that transcends the state bounds and also ideally international. And the NIST standard that Elzar was mentioning in the 4 documents that, of course, were published this morning in honor of our panel, just to show you the pace of how this is working. One of those documents is actually a call for international collaboration. It's a request for like public comment on like an international standard with respect to AI risk management, which is ideally really the direction we should go in, because otherwise, as we know from, as I know with clients from the privacy space, when you have 17 different state laws, the level of like 3D Tetris that you are trying to play with, what actually applies, what is my obligation, am I here, am I not here, what do I do, gets very complicated. Notwithstanding that, we're still seeing state law trends in the bills, right? And like one sort of trend that we're seeing is the California, Connecticut, Colorado bias risk assessment type legislation, which has a lot of governance and risk requirements for. They also do the developer deployer thing. I feel like, the Google search on the word deployer that had never been used ever has like spiked ever since the AI Act started. But now we have them in some of the US bills, and like those laws, first of all, they all tackle bias specifically, because I guess bias is one thing that everybody's aligned on. There are a bunch of others that are aligned on transparency, right? People need to know that they are interacting with AI, or that the picture, the video, whatever they're looking at is synthetic, is the word that they're using. Also, because we want to deliver on the transparency, our blurb for the panel also talked about propaganda. There are a number of bills out there. I think maybe did Florida pass the political AI thing? I don't know if it's a bill or already passed. But Florida is very close to a law regulating the use of AI in political campaigns, specifically in the context of disinformation. And so those are kind of spots where there's alignment on it. But basically, I think, and this is what I want us to wrap up with, is kind of if you're to the audience that is either a developer or a deployer, what are 1-2 things that they should be thinking about or doing, either to deal with what they're doing now or to affect the direction in which they will be regulated? Do you want to start again, Elzar?
Yeah, sure. So my biggest concern would be automation bias. Is people tend to believe what comes out of Google, they tend to believe what comes out of the internet, and I'm concerned that the widespread use of LLMs will kind of continue. Now, that's going to be very positive if the information is good, but if the information is bad, I'm concerned about misinformation or potentially disinformation. So that's one thing I'm concerned about. And quickly, the other thing I want to make sure that we understand is you're not going to prevent employees from using large language models. We have some organizations who feel they can just block it, and maybe that prevents it on their network. It is on their phones. For those of you who use WhatsApp, it is now it's a search feature within WhatsApp. LLMs are going to be used by your employees. Accept it and come up with acceptable use policies and rules around how to control it.
So this is, I would summarize as, it's not if you can't beat them, join them. If you can't beat them, train them so they can join you.
Yeah, I think from a developer standpoint, a framework that I would like to give away is what I call the CLEAR framework, CLEAR. And when you're building any AI tool or system, the first step, that is C, is collect your data responsibly. So make sure when you're doing the data collection, and as they say, like data is the heart of any AI system, collect the data responsibly. Make sure it is not overrepresented or underrepresented. Second one is leverage explainability tools. Again, like we talked about explainability or transparency, use the existing tools while building your AI system so that it can explain why it made a particular prediction. Third one is eliminate bias. So again, bias, as everybody agrees, is critical to developing no bias should be there in any AI system. Again, there are tools for that, like IBM Fairness. So use those tools. So leverage, so collect data responsibly, leverage explainability tools, eliminate bias. Then we move on to A, which is act on those insights. So whatever insights we got from the explainability and the bias, act on it, remove, change the data, update the model. Last but not the least, report the transparency. So when you're projecting the answers from the LLM, make sure you project the transparency or explainability to it. So that's what I would like to give away.
I'd say the 1-minute answer, 30-second answer, because we're running out of time. We've got to educate policymakers. Everyone in this room knows how it works, but the policymakers writing the laws really don't have experience in this and don't really know how it's going to change our societies and how we work and how we do business. So really educating our policymakers and explaining the state-by-state approach isn't just complicated and burdensome, it's actually stifling to innovation. Because you end up doing the lowest common denominator if you operate in multiple jurisdictions. You're not going to be able to do certain applications in one area. Just, if you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, you're just going to do the base application that you can do everywhere. And that's really stifling innovation. So for those in this room, I would say advocate, meet with your state officials, and really educate on how AI is transformative and not so scary all the time.
Which is really interesting because they're part of the legal requirements in some of the bills and the laws, and definitely in all of the progeny of the executive order. Like there's a memo from the Office of the Management of the Budget that says that you need to have, all of the agencies need a chief AI officer, and you need to have people that are, that know all this stuff. So I think that the takeaway here is that also the people that make the rules need to have these people while in the room making the rules, because there is a real impact on it, and there was a real live impact. And then I think there usually is a kind of lights on feature that will allow us to see you when you guys do the Q&A. But until that happens, I also wanted to, my takeaway from what Swagata was saying, the clear requirements, like there's an app for that. There is a law for that, for every single one of the things she said, right? The collect responsibly, there is a data minimization and accuracy requirement in all of the laws. Transparency is a requirement in all of the laws, and the FTC, which is regulating, is really looking for it. Bias, of course. I mean, if it's been, the other rule of thumb is, if it's illegal, if it has been illegal to do on your own, it is going to still be illegal if AI does it. And so that's also, to David's point, that's also a good rule of thumb, right? Like, we already have things that are illegal. We just need to kind of make sure that AI is also captured in it, because the risks are amplified by AI, and some of them are sort of, but there's, in a lot of, there are new risks, but a lot of them are already handled. So basically, rule of thumb for you, if you cannot discriminate in hiring yourself, you can't engage, and you can't hire somebody to discriminate for you. You also can't hire AI to discriminate for you. And the piece on act on it and report it, right? That there is an ongoing monitoring requirement. That's also in all of the, in the bills and some of the pieces on the executive order. So while what, like David was saying, there is a big difference between the developer and the deployer still is responsible to kind of keep their eyes open if something happens and you realize that there's an issue. You can't just keep using this if you realize that there's an obvious issue. You can't just keep using the AI because, it was okay, like last week, or because, the developer told you, right? Because you're going to be on the hook for it. So I don't know if there are any questions, and if there are, if you can like step forward or stand up, because we see you in oh, there we go. The haze of green has lifted, yeah.
Mike is coming.
I do have a microphone.
Is there a common legal definition for what AI is? Is that?
Deterministic programming end and AI start?
Ooh, David, do you want to take that one?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure there's a single definition in these statutes.
Yeah, the short answer is no, there isn't. The longer answer is that first of all, what is sort of implicit in your question is that even though everybody's saying AI, right, it didn't really start. Yes, it wasn't born with ChatGPT, right? Like it used to be. I think Elzar probably remembers in Swagata when like the not cool people were saying machine learning, and now it's AI, and now it's like it's been rebranded, right? AI is like the prime of machine learning, basically, right? So it's not a new thing. The importance of the definition is not really in defining what AI is. It's basically, to David's point, it is how do you define it, because the significance of the definition now imposes a ton of obligations that didn't exist. And that's why in the AI Act discussions, there was a lot of lobbying and pressure about generative AI. Is generative AI like high risk, which is the AI Act standard, or not? Because if it is, now you've created a whole situation. So I think to my knowledge, there is not an alignment on the definition, but that, to what David was saying, is really important that there be an alignment on the definition.
But it does seem like everything is a lot broader maybe than it should be. So like I was saying, different applications really do different things. They're all falling into the common nomenclature of AI, even if it's not the legal definition of AI. Maybe that's because everyone wants their machine learning now to be cooler and other things we're using it for, but I think everything is going to fall into this broader category, and we got to be careful because we don't want to suck everything in because the risks are really different.
And I would say one more thing, which is David is saying it is risky that the legal definition is overly broad. The other risk, which we have seen with clients, is that the marketing enthusiasm is really broad. And we have seen, documents. We were looking at the AI Act, and we said, oh, well, you need to do like 50 risk assessments on your AI systems. They're like, we don't do AI systems. Like, your marketing thing says that all of this is AI. So that's the flip side, right? Like, the law can't be too broad, but you can't, if it's not AI, don't call it AI, because that will have consequences. I saw somebody, there was another question somewhere.
Yeah. My question is, what are the legal implications for companies that offer AI models as products that make financial decisions for the people that could use? And is there any regulatory framework for these companies they could use as guidelines?
Should I take that one? So if personal information is involved, which the question was about financial things that have financial implications for people. So if personal information is involved, there is a standard in the privacy laws which is legally or similarly significant effects. That is a statement that was copy-pasted from the European GDPR, which is the European privacy law. And we do have pretty much a consensus in the state laws as to what that means. Legal is if there is a legal impact. Similarly significant is that if, as the result, and some laws say primary impact or primary output or whatever, if the point of the AI, right, results in you not getting access to a financial service or an employment opportunity, which is why we were talking about recruitment, or education, or housing, that is a legal or similarly significant effect, which, if caused by AI, there is extra stuff you need to do, and that extra stuff usually means transparency, risk assessment, and in a lot of cases also some sort of non-automated alternative. More questions?
There's a follow-up.
So I just had a follow-up. Can you hear me? So we've developed software for many years, and all of a sudden we're putting AI enabled in front of all of our software because it's cool marketing. But maybe we ought not do that, because then we're kind of falling into all of this regulation. I wasn't aware of all this regulation, so this is fascinating to me. So do we need to be careful about marketing things as AI enabled?
Yes.
Yeah. And I would say just be truthful, right, with the clients. And I know sometimes from a marketing perspective, so we have organizations that we're working with that are using things like ISO 42001 as marketing material to say, not only do we use AI, we are certified to say that we're using it responsibly. I think you can do both. As long as you're taking the right frameworks, if you're taking things we talked earlier about NIST 800-218, if you're developing software appropriately, and you're putting the right controls in place, you're doing the system impacts, you're protected because you're doing what you're supposed to do. So I wouldn't let it scare you. I would just make sure the proper controls are in place, and then support the business objectives as you can.
And just to add to that, like AI is way broader than we think. We think when we hear AI is like a complex neural network or something very complicated, but even simplistic statistics model fall under the category of AI. So if you're terming it as AI, it's not necessarily a complex neural network or a complicated system.
And to amplify what Elzar was saying, so when should, the question was, should we be careful with respect to the statements that we make in our marketing materials with respect to AI? The answer is yes, right? That you definitely need to be careful. And the careful isn't necessarily don't say or do say, but you need to make truthful statements in your marketing materials. If FTC has been enforcing statements and endorsements for a long time, so they need to be accurate. And the only way for them to be accurate is for you to know what you're doing and know what went into it and be able to present it in a truthful and accurate way.
So my question is in reference to something that was said about if you can't beat them, train them. I love that. Is there any practical advice from the panel around the best practices to do that? So you have new staff that are coming on, you have staff that have been doing things for a long time, everybody wants to interact with these LLMs, whether it is through guided practice at the company or outside of that. I'm just curious if any of you have any examples of ways that you've seen companies be really effective in training their staff to be more responsible with how they interact with these technologies.
Yeah, so I would say a well-written, acceptable use policy that has been approved and weighed in by legal, HR, and IT security or compliance, wherever it might fall in your organization. I would say when you onboard, if you have like security awareness training, to have a module specifically about how they can use large language models. And then I would say enforcement. If people are not using them or following the rules, it has to be clear that there's going to be some kind of consequence. So it can't just be, oh, we have a policy, but they don't really check. It has to be logged, and it has to be checked, and people need to be held accountable.
And I would add two more things. One is training, and if the new standards like the Office of Management of the Budget and some of the other bills have a requirement for specialized training. So like the general workforce that you're going to allow to use, ChatGPT subject to parameters, right? There's some sort of general training. This is how it works. This is what you do. This is what you don't do, right? There is a quiz at the end. There is like accountability, right? People that actually, like Swagata's, teams, like people that actually develop the AI, deploy the AI, implement the AI, obviously they need a different type of, training. And the other thing that I would say is there's a nonprofit, there's a think tank called the Future of Privacy Forum, and they issued a paper with like 10 points on this type of thing, and which may be a good resource for you. And what they say is another piece, so there's the acceptable use policy, there's the training, and also there is accountability and transparency in the organization. So you need to have a way to kind of log the queries and be able to have like report and whatever, so you can have this type of control. So if something happens, you know about it, and then you're able to take the right steps. So I see that we have a pause in the questions, and also we have a wrap up now. So we're going to wrap up now, and feel free to connect. I mean, from me, I can invite people to connect with me, reach out on LinkedIn or an email, whatever, and we'll be around for questions. So thank you very much, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.